There is a date on a calendar in a house in western Colorado that is more dangerous than any road in that county, and for 2 years nobody noticed it, including the mother who lived in the house. It is the 9th of March. It is a man's birthday. He is not in the house. He is not in the state, and for most of those 2 years he is not in the country. He has never raised his voice in that house, never set foot in it, never met the man who lives there now, and every year and every month in between, that date and the days around it are the most physically dangerous hours in a 13-year-old boy's life. I'm Nathan. I want to be honest about why this one took me 3 weeks to be able to tell. There is a version of this story that is just a man coming home to hurt somebody, and I'd have understood if it went that way. It doesn't. What actually happens in this story is stranger, colder, and much better, and it turns on a single realization that nobody, not the doctors, not the school, not the police, not the mother, had thought to have. They were all looking at a boy's injuries. Not one of them looked at a calendar. By the end of this, a man who spent 11 years being the most admired human being in that valley is finished. He is not finished by a beating. He is finished, in front of everyone he ever lied to, by the exact thing he spent 2 years telling a child was worthless. Stay with the dates, they're the whole story. Kyler Haverly's job, for 19 years, was to go into places nobody could reach and come back out with somebody alive. That is not a poetic description of it. That is the literal job description. He was a pararescueman, a PJ, and the shorthand people use is combat search and rescue, which makes it sound like a job about combat. It is a job about medicine performed in conditions that would make an emergency room physician sit down on the floor. A PJ is a paramedic first and a great many other things afterward. He is a paramedic who can also jump out of an aircraft at night into water, who can dive, who can climb, who can rig a hoist, who can carry 180 pounds of another person across broken ground, and who can, while doing all of that, run a surgical airway on a man whose face is no longer a face. Kyler had done that last thing 11 times in his career. He could tell you the name of every one of the 11, and whether they lived. 9 of them lived. He had, sewn onto a patch he almost never wore, 4 words that get put on a lot of coffee mugs and understood by almost nobody. That others may live. People hear that and think it means bravery. It doesn't. Bravery is a mood. It comes and goes. What that sentence actually is, in practice, is a constraint. It means the decision is already made. It means that when you get to the person, you work, and the identity of the person, and what they have done, and how you feel about them, are not inputs. There is no clause. That is the entire content of it, and it is the least romantic and most demanding idea I have ever come across in one of these stories, and it is going to matter enormously about 40 minutes from now. There is one call of his I have to put in, because everything at the end of this story is decided by it, and by 400 like it. In 2016, a helicopter went into the water 11 miles off a coastline I am not going to name, at night, in a 4-foot swell, with 7 people in it. Kyler Haverly and 2 other PJs went out the back of an aircraft into that water in the dark, with no idea what they were dropping onto. He worked for 6 hours. 6. He found 5 of the 7. 2 of the 5 were dead when he got to them, and he brought them out anyway, because you always bring them out. One of the 3 living was a 22-year-old crew chief with a flail chest, who Kyler kept breathing, in the water, holding a seal over a sucking wound with the heel of his own hand for 51 minutes because the occlusive dressing had washed away in the first 30 seconds. That crew chief is alive. He has 2 daughters. He named neither of them after Kyler Haverly, and Kyler has never met either of them, and the 2 men exchange exactly 1 message a year, on an anniversary, and it says nothing. The point is not that he is a hero. The point is what 6 hours in the water does to a person's decision architecture. After you have done that once, do I help this individual is no longer a live question you ask yourself. The question has been permanently answered somewhere below the level you have access to. Men who do that job for 19 years do not become braver. They become narrower. In a way that is very hard to explain to people and impossible to switch off. And every single one of them will tell you the same thing, which is that they envy people who still get to decide. He was 41. He was not a large man, 5'9", built compact and thick through the shoulders and back the way people are when their job is carrying things, not lifting them. He had a long white scar along the outside of his right forearm from a hoist cable and a permanent, faintly comical crook in his left little finger from a door in 2011. He was quiet in a way that people frequently mistook for coldness, and that was actually a kind of enormous, permanent tiredness that never quite cleared. He had been married to a woman named Nissa for 11 years, and they had one son, Lowen, and the marriage ended in the way that a very large number of those marriages end, not in a fight, not in an affair, but in an accumulation. 211 days deployed 1 year, 180 the next, a wedding missed, 2 Christmases missed, a surgery she went into alone. She did not leave him for a villain. She left because she had done 6 years of arithmetic, and the arithmetic came out the same every time. Kyler did not fight it. That is important. He agreed to the parenting plan his lawyer told him was bad, because contesting it would have meant a custody evaluation, and a custody evaluation for a man who is legally unable to say where he is going or when he is coming back is a hearing you lose before you walk in. So Lowen lived with his mother in the house on Threadgold Road, in a town of 2,200 people in Yurgen County, Colorado, and Kyler saw him for 4 weeks a year, in blocks, and called when he could, which was sometimes weekly and sometimes not for a month. Lowen Haverly was 11 when this story's clock starts, and 13 when it ends. He was a small kid, small for 11, and he stayed small, with his mother's dark hair and his father's absolutely unnerving stillness. He collected topographic maps. That was his thing, actual paper Usquez quadrangles, which he bought for $6 each at a shop in Montrose, and pinned to his bedroom wall in a grid, and he could look at a set of contour lines and tell you which way water would run. He was not a dramatic child. He did not act out. In 2 years of what happened to him, he made exactly 1 complaint to 1 adult, and I'll get to it. And Nissa. I have to be careful with Nissa, because it would be very easy to write her as the villain of this, and she is not, and if you make her the villain, you learn nothing. Nissa Haverly was 39, worked as a physical therapist at a clinic in Montrose, 40 minutes each way, and had spent 6 years being the only functioning adult in a household. When she remarried, 2 years after the divorce, she married a man that the entire county thought was the single best thing that had ever happened to her. They were not being polite. They meant it. Bassett Pallister was 38 and everybody called him Bass, and if you had asked anyone in Yurgen County to name the best man in the valley, better than half of them would have said his name without pausing. He was the deputy commander of the county's volunteer search and rescue team. He had been on it for 11 years. He had a wall, an actual wall, in an actual den, that people were shown, of framed newspaper clippings, county commendations, a plaque from a family in Texas, 2 photographs of himself on a litter carry in a whiteout, and a certificate of appreciation signed by a governor. He ran a small backcountry outfitting business out of a converted barn, guided hunts in the fall, snowmobile tours in winter, a couple of hut trips. It made money the way those businesses make money, which is to say, barely, in bursts, held together by charm and a line of credit. And he was, genuinely, charming. That's the part people struggle with. Bass Pallister remembered the name of your kid. He plowed the driveway of a widow on Kettle Road for 11 winters and never once mentioned it. He gave a eulogy at a funeral in 2018 that people in that valley still talk about. He was funny in the specific, generous way that makes a room feel like it's doing well. Bass Pallister came out of a family that had been in that valley since 1911 and had been nobody in it the entire time. That is not nothing. In a small place, being from a family that has never been anybody is a kind of weather you grow up inside. His father drove a water truck for the county for 31 years and was known, when he was known, as the man you called about a culvert. Bass did 4 semesters at Mesa State and came home. He worked at a tire shop, then at a hardware store, then guided elk hunts for a man named Ockerby who paid him in cash and treated him like furniture. And in 2013, at 26, he went out on his first search, a walk-in grid line for a missing hiker, the lowest skill task in the entire discipline, the thing they give to anybody with boots. And they found her, and she was alive, and there was a photograph in the county paper with 11 volunteers in it, and Bass Pallister was in the second row. 240 people told him he was a good man that month. 240. In a town of 2,200. I do not think he set out to lie. I think what happened to Bass Pallister is the thing that happens to a certain kind of person the first time they are widely admired for something and discover, immediately afterward, that the admiration does not require the thing. The rope course was $290 and 4 days off work. The Swiftwater technician course was in Salida and cost $1,100 with lodging. The Avalanche organized rescue course ran in January, which is his best money month. Nobody checked. That's the whole crime. For 11 years. In a volunteer county team. In a state with a registry nobody audits. The roster is filled in by the team, and the team fills it in from what people say, and Bass Pallister said. And every year the gap between what the roster said and what he could actually do got a little wider, and every year the number of people who would be shocked got a little larger, and after about year 6 the gap stopped being a thing he could ever close, because closing it would have required saying it out loud. He was also, and this is not a contradiction, a man who had at some point in his early 20s discovered that being widely believed is the most powerful thing a person can have, and had spent every year since accumulating it, and had gradually stopped being able to tell the difference between being good and being believed to be good. By the time he married Nissa Haverly, the two had come completely apart in him, and once they come apart, the thing that has to be defended is not the goodness, it's the belief. You have to understand what a county like Jurgen actually is, because the whole story runs on it. 2,200 people. One high school with a graduating class of 41. One grocery store, 2 bars, a hardware store, a clinic that is open 4 days a week, and a hospital 40 minutes down a canyon that closes in February about once every 3 years. One newspaper that comes out on Thursdays and is written by 2 people. And a volunteer search and rescue team of 31 people, which is not a hobby club. In a county that size, with that terrain, 11 14,000-foot peaks inside the line, 4 drainages, a state highway that goes over a pass at 11,000 feet. SAR is the difference between a bad afternoon and a funeral, 6 or 7 times a year. Nobody is paid. Everybody has a job. When the pager goes, a plumber and a school teacher and a woman who runs the feed store leave what they are doing. Which means that in a place like that, the SAR roster is not a list of qualifications. It is a moral hierarchy. It is the closest thing that Valley has to a nobility. And it means something else, which is the load-bearing fact of this entire story. In a county of 2,200 people, the people who investigate you, prosecute you, treat you, teach your children, and sit on your jury are all people who have stood next to you on a hillside at 3 in the morning. That is not corruption. Not one person in this story is corrupt. It is something much harder to fight than corruption, which is familiarity. When you have carried a litter with a man for 11 years, your brain will do an enormous amount of unconscious work to avoid the conclusion that he is a person who pushes children into workbenches. It will find you 3 reasonable alternatives before you have finished having the thought. Bass Pallister had not bought that county. He had earned it, honestly. One cold night at a time, doing the part of the job he actually could do. Carrying, walking, being cheerful at 4 a.m., being there. And then he had spent it. The first injury was in the November after the wedding. Lowen was 11. He came off the back steps and put his left arm out and broke his wrist, a buccal fracture of the distal radius, which is the single most common fracture in a child that age. Nissa was at work. Bass drove him in. Bass was, by every account including the nurses, wonderful, calm, funny, got him a milkshake, sat with him for the cast. That fracture was real, and it was an accident. I want to be completely clear about that, because it matters to how the next 2 years were possible. The first one was true. What it did was establish a shape. It established that Lowen Haverly was a clumsy kid. It established that Bass Pallister was the man who took him to the hospital. And it established, in a small clinic in a small county, in a file, a first entry. The second injury was in February. A greenstick fracture of 2 ribs, discovered 9 days after it happened, when Lowen finally said something hurt. The third was in April, a chipped tooth and a split lip. Skateboard. The fourth was in July, a burn on the inside of the left forearm, about 4 centimeters, treated at home. The fifth was in September, a concussion. He was kept home from school for 6 days. By the end of that first year, there were 9 entries between the clinic file, the school nurse's log, and the insurance claims, and not one of them, individually, was anything. That's the thing people cannot get their heads around. Every single one of those, on its own, is a completely ordinary childhood. Kids break wrists, kids chip teeth, kids get concussions. If you take any one of those 9 incidents and put it in front of any physician on earth, they see nothing, because there is nothing there. The pattern is not in the injuries. The pattern is not even in the number, though the number is high. The pattern is in when. Nobody looked at when. Here is what was actually happening in that house, and it took 2 years and 3 separate documents to reconstruct it. Bass Pallister was not a rage monster. He did not come home drunk and swing. If he had, this would have ended in 6 weeks, because that is a thing a school notices, and a mother notices, and a county responds to. What Bass Pallister was a man who could not tolerate a rival, and who had identified one, and who was 11 years old. The rival was not physically present. That is what made it unbearable. Bass Pallister had married into a house where a photograph of another man stood on a boy's bookshelf, where the boy had a shoebox of patches and a folded flag-shaped shadow box that was not for a dead man, but for a living one, where a 13-year-old, asked at school to write about someone he admired, wrote about a man he saw 4 weeks a year. And Bass, who was the deputy commander of search and rescue, who plowed a widow's driveway, who had a wall, could not be the best man in that house, because in that house the best man was somebody who wasn't there, whose absence made him better, whose job was, in the plainest possible terms, the thing Bass Pallister pretended his was. That is the whole psychology, and it is small and stupid, and it broke a child's skull. The mechanism was the phone. Kyler Haverly's contact was irregular by necessity. Sometimes he could call, sometimes he could email, sometimes there was nothing for 5 weeks. What that meant, practically, was that contact was almost always initiated from Lowen's side. The boy would ask his mother to try, or would send a message into an account, or would ask to use the tablet. And what happened, over 2 years, was this. Within roughly 48 hours of every attempt Lowen made to reach his father, something happened to Lowen. Not always big, usually small. A shove into a doorframe that got called roughhousing, an arm grabbed too hard, a wrestling session that went on too long and stopped being a game about 4 minutes in, a hand on the back of the neck at the sink, a ride home from practice on a forest road, going too fast, on purpose, with the boy told to hold on and laugh. And every one of them was deniable, and every one of them was accompanied by a version, cheerfully offered to Nissa the same evening, in which Lowen had been roughhousing, or being dramatic, or had a growth spurt and got clumsy. Bass Pallister was not punishing the boy for anything the boy did. He was punishing him for reaching. And the boy, this is the part that takes the wind out of me, worked it out. He worked it out at 12, on his own, with no one to tell. He never once articulated it. What he did instead was he stopped calling. The gap in the records is the loudest thing in the whole file. Between the June and the following February, there is not one attempted contact with his father, and there is not one injury. 7 months of nothing. A quiet, well-behaved, small, careful child who had learned the rule and was following it perfectly. And then it was March, and it was his father's birthday. Lowen Haverly asked his mother, on the 7th of March, whether he could call his dad on the 9th, because it was his birthday. Nissa said yes. Of course she did. She said yes, in the kitchen, at about 6 in the evening, in front of her husband, in a house where nothing was wrong, and she thought about it for approximately 4 seconds afterward. Kyler was, on the 9th of March, at an airfield he is still not able to name, 40 minutes from stepping onto an aircraft for an insertion that had been planned for 11 weeks. The call never came. What happened on the evening of the 8th of March, in a converted barn on Threadgold Road, is described in a court document that is not sealed and which I have read 3 times and will summarize once. Bass asked Lowen to come out and help him move something. Nissa was on a shift. The something was a snowmobile that did not need moving. There was an argument that lasted somewhere between 4 and 11 minutes, and it was not about the phone call. It was about whether Lowen had put a tool back, which he had. At some point, Bass Pallister put both hands on a 13-year-old boy's chest and pushed him, hard, backward, into the edge of a steel workbench. Lowen went down onto concrete and hit the back of his head on the corner of a floor jack. He had a linear skull fracture, an epidural bleed that the surgeons caught in time, 3 broken ribs, and a lung that collapsed on the drive down. And Bass Pallister, deputy commander of Yergin County Search and Rescue, put him in the truck himself and drove him 40 minutes to Montrose and carried him into the emergency department and told the intake nurse that the boy had fallen off the roof of the barn. He told them a version, and the version was good, and he had told 23 versions before it, and this one was going to work like all the others, except that this time the boy was awake for the first 11 minutes. Nurse Reet Bolander was 34 years old and had been a trauma nurse for 9 years and had the specific, unglamorous kind of experience that does not show up in any of this until it decides everything. She was doing the secondary survey. Bass Pallister had gone out to move the truck. And Lowen Haverly, concussed, hypoxic, in the worst pain of his life, 13 years old, said 7 words to her. He said, "I only asked to call my dad." She wrote it down. That is the entire heroism of Reet Bolander, and it is enough for a whole life. She did not draw a conclusion. She did not accuse anybody. She wrote, in the nursing note, at 21:14, in quotation marks, exactly what the patient said, which is what you are taught to do, and which approximately half of people actually do at hour 11 of a shift. Then she went out to the desk and did the second thing, which was to ask a question she was allowed to ask. She pulled the boy's prior visits. 9 entries in 26 months. And Reet Bolander, who did not know what she had, made a mandatory report. 2 more things about that emergency department, because they decide the rest. The first is that Bass Pallister came back in from moving the truck at about 21:26 and was, by 4 separate accounts, magnificent. He cried. He said the word roof 9 times. He asked twice, with what a charge nurse described in a statement as perfect warmth, whether the boy had said anything. Reet Bolander told him no. She has never explained why she said that. She was asked, on the stand, and she said, "I didn't have a reason. I just didn't like the question." The second thing is the report itself. A mandatory report from an ED nurse in a rural county is a form. It goes to a hotline, and a screener triages it, and the vast, vast majority of them go nowhere, and everybody in that building knows it. Reet Bolander had made 11 of them in 9 years. 2 had ever gone anywhere. What made this one different was 1 line, and she put it in deliberately, in the narrative box, at the very bottom, after all the clinical detail. 9 prior presentations in 26 months. Stated mechanism inconsistent with posterior injury pattern. That's it. That's the sentence. A screener in Grand Junction read it at 6 a.m., and a screener's whole job is triage, and that one sentence moved a form from a pile that gets a phone call in 9 days to a pile that gets a detective the same morning. An entire man's life came apart because a tired nurse wrote 1 more line than she had to at the end of a 12-hour shift. Kyler Haverly was in a briefing tent when a staff sergeant came in and said his name in a tone that made 11 men look up. The call was patched through from the family readiness line, and it was a physician in Montrose, Colorado. And the sentence he heard was, "We're treating your son for a fractured skull and a collapsed lung. He's stable. He's going to surgery in about 40 minutes. He asked to speak to him. They said he was not able to. He asked again, and the physician, a woman named Dr. Saskia Redgrave, who had 2 kids of her own, did something outside protocol and held the phone to the boy's head for 11 seconds. And Kyler Haverly, 4,500 miles away, standing in a tent with a map of somebody else's country on the wall, heard his 13-year-old son crying and heard him say in pieces, "Mom's new husband did this, after I asked to call you. On your birthday." The line was open for another 9 seconds, and then it was Dr. Redgrave again, and then it was nothing. His commanding officer was a lieutenant colonel named Fergus Ranstead, and he had been standing 4 feet away for the entire call. What he said, in front of the team, is quoted in exactly the same words by 3 men who were there. He said, "Mission's scrubbed. There's a C-17 lifting in 90 minutes. It's yours." Nobody argued. Not one person in that tent argued. 2 of them walked him to the flight line. He was in the air for 18 hours and 40 minutes with nothing to do. I want to spend a moment there, because everything downstream comes out of those 18 hours. A man in that situation has one job, and the job is to not arrive as a weapon. Kyler Haverly knew that with total clarity, because he had watched what happens to men who arrive as weapons. You get one fight, you get arrested, and then the person you came for gets to be the reasonable one for the rest of his life. He had seen it happen twice to people he liked. So he did the only thing available to him, which was the thing he had been trained to do for 19 years, in every aircraft he had ever ridden into anything. He ran the problem. Not the fight. The problem. What is the actual problem? What does the terrain look like? What do I have? What do I not have? Who is on the ground? What will happen in the first 4 hours? What will happen in the first 4 days? And what does winning look like? And somewhere over the Atlantic, Kyler Haverly worked out that winning did not look like Bass Pallister in a hospital bed. Winning looked like Bass Pallister in a room full of people who believed him, not being believed anymore. Because he'd understood something on that flight that the prosecutors hadn't yet. A man like that does not go down for one incident. One incident is a he said, she said, with a concussed 13-year-old against a search and rescue commander, with a wall of commendations, in a county where everyone knows him. Bass Pallister had survived 23 versions. He would survive the 24th. He'd cry in the interview. He'd take a plea to something small. He'd be back on the SAR roster in 18 months. What Kyler had to do was take away the thing that made all 24 versions work. He landed in Denver at 4:40 in the morning and drove 5 hours and did not go to the house. He went to the hospital, and he sat with his son, and for 11 days he did almost nothing else. I've read the statements, and I've read a long piece a local reporter wrote afterward, and I want to put in the 2 things that are not about the case. The first is that on the 3rd day, Lowen, who could not turn his head and who had a drain in his chest and who was on a level of pain medication that made him slur, asked his father whether he was in trouble for telling the nurse. The second is that Kyler Haverly, who had had a surgical airway in his hands 11 times, could not answer that question for about 40 seconds. Then he said no. Then he said, "You did the exact right thing." And then he said the sentence that his son repeated to a therapist 8 months later, which is the reason we know it. He said, "You did it in the right order. You told the person who writes things down." The 11 days in that hospital are the part nobody puts in the version they share, and they are the part that I think actually did the work. Kyler Haverly did not talk to his son about Bass Pallister, not once in 11 days. Detective Kressler had asked him not to, for evidentiary reasons, and he would have done it anyway. What he did instead was he brought in maps. He went to a shop in Montrose, and he bought every quadrangle they had for that end of the county. 11 of them, $6 each, and he spread them on the tray table, and for 11 days a 13-year-old with a drain in his chest and a shaved patch on his skull taught his father where the water goes. A nurse said in a statement that she came in on day 6, and the 2 of them had 4 sheets laid out and taped together, and were arguing, with some heat, about whether a drainage on the north side of the Threadgold Divide fed into the creek or over the divide into the next watershed, and that the boy was correct and the father conceded, and that both of them were completely absorbed, and neither of them looked up. That is the whole of it. 11 days, no speeches. 2 people who had been given 4 weeks a year getting 240 consecutive hours. Lowen Haverly told a therapist 8 months later that the first time he believed he was going to be okay was not when his father arrived. It was on the 4th day, when he said something about a contour interval, and his father said, "Show me," and meant it. Nissa arrived at the hospital at 2 a.m. on the 9th. She had been at the clinic. Bass had called her at 9:30 with a version. She believed the version for a little under 31 hours. What broke it was not her ex-husband, who did not say a single accusatory word to her for the entire 11 days. What broke it was a question she asked a nurse about the timeline, and the answer not matching, by about 2 hours, the version she had been given. And then she sat down in a corridor and did, silently, in her own head, over about 4 hours, the arithmetic that this entire story is about. She was the first person on Earth to see it, and she saw it without any documents at all. She just started listing the times he had been hurt, and then she started listing what had been happening in the house in the days before, and somewhere around the 5th item she stopped being able to breathe properly. I want to say this clearly, because a lot of people watching will want to hate her. She did the hardest thing anybody in this story does. She looked directly at a thing that made her, in her own eyes, unforgivable, and she did not look away from it, and she did not spend one single hour trying to make it smaller. She was in the sheriff's office at 8 the next morning with a list she had written on hospital notepaper. Here is where the story turns from what happened into what Kyler Haverly did about it, and it starts with a request that the detective, a woman named Zandra Kressler, thought at first was a strange thing to ask for. He asked her for the dates. SEP, not the injuries, not the imaging, not the interviews. He asked for a clean list of every date, from every source, on which Lowen Haverly had been treated, examined, sent home from school, or reported unwell, from the wedding forward. And then he went and got a second list that nobody had thought to build, because nobody had a reason to. He got the contact log. 3 sources, and none of them curated by anybody in that house. 1. His own service email account and the family readiness system, which timestamps every message and every attempted call through the deployed line, and which he had never deleted anything from in 19 years. 2. Nissa's cell records, which she pulled herself, which showed every attempt she had made on her son's behalf. 3. And this is the one that decided the case, the boy's tablet. Lowen had a school-issued tablet. On it, in the notes application, auto-saved and synced and never deleted, because a 13-year-old does not think about that, were 41 unsent drafts of messages to his father, each one timestamped to the second. 41 attempts to reach out that nobody in that house ever knew about. Written and not sent. Kyler Haverly laid the 2 lists side by side on a table in a sheriff's substation in a town of 2,200 people, with a detective and a deputy prosecutor named Zosia Brennick, and what came out of it stopped conversation in the room. 19 of the 23 documented incidents fell within 48 hours of a contact attempt. 14 fell within 24. And the 7-month gap, the long, quiet, injury-free stretch that a defense attorney would have used to prove there was no pattern, contained not one contact attempt. Not one. Not a call, not a message, not a draft. The absence proved it harder than the presence. Zosia Brennick, who was 36 and had done 4 of these and lost 2 of them, looked at that for a long time and then said, quietly, "This isn't a child abuse case. This is a stalking case where the victim's a serving airman and the weapon is his kid." They charged it as felony child abuse resulting in serious bodily injury, plus counts for the earlier incidents. And Bass Pallister did exactly what Kyler had predicted on the aircraft. He got a lawyer named Octavian Sedlak out of Grand Junction, who was very good and not cheap, and the defense that was assembled over the following 4 months was, I have to admit, formidable. It went like this. Boys get hurt. This one is small and clumsy and had a documented sensory processing evaluation at age 8. His mother works 40 minutes away and is exhausted. His father is a man he barely sees, who has, understandably, a great deal of guilt, and who has arrived after 2 years of absence and constructed a theory. The pattern is a coincidence dressed up by a man with a military intelligence background, and they use that phrase deliberately, over and over. And the boy's own statement was made 11 minutes after a head injury, hypoxic, on a backboard, and behind all of it, holding it up, was the wall. Because character witnesses were going to line up around the building, the sheriff's own SAR liaison, 2 county commissioners, the family from Texas, a widow from Kettle Road who was going to weep on the stand about 11 winters of plowed driveway. Zosia Brennick told Kyler, in June, in a corridor, that she thought it was 50-50, And Kyler Haverly said, "Then we take the wall down." I need to tell you what he actually did, because it is the most careful, patient, and quietly devastating thing in this entire story, and there is not one illegal act in it. He volunteered for search and rescue, not in Yurgen County, in the county to the south, where nobody had a stake, and where the training officer was a retired flight paramedic who nearly dropped his coffee when a 19-year PJ walked in and asked to fill out a form. And from inside that world, the world of certification cards, recert dates, regional training records, incident reports, and the extremely boring paperwork that mountain rescue in the American West actually runs on, Kyler Haverly did the thing that no prosecutor and no detective could have done, because it required somebody who knew what a real credential looks like. He read Bass Pallister's. Every SAR volunteer in that region has a training file. It is not secret. A lot of it is a matter of public record, because the teams are county entities, funded by county money, and the state maintains a registry. And what Kyler found, over 5 weeks of the most tedious work he had ever done, was this. Bass Pallister was not certified in 5 of the 11 disciplines listed under his name on the county roster, not lapsed, never held. High-angle rope rescue, never completed the practical. Swiftwater, a 2-day awareness course in 2013, listed on the roster as technician. Avalanche organized rescue, nothing. Wilderness EMT, expired in 2016 and never renewed, while he had continued to sign patient care reports for 9 years. And one more. In 2019, on a call on the Threadgold drainage, a 58-year-old man named Marco Ostberg went into the water below a snow bridge and was extracted 41 minutes later and did not survive. Bass Pallister was the ranking responder on scene. He wrote the incident report. The report said the extraction was delayed by terrain. The team's own radio log, which was archived by the county because everything is archived by the county, said something quite different. It said there was a 9-minute window at the beginning, during which the ranking responder ordered a downstream approach instead of an upstream one, which is exactly the wrong call, which is the specific thing you learn in the Swiftwater technician course he had never taken. Kyler Haverly did not take that to the newspaper. He did not take it to social media. He did not take it to Bass Pallister. He took it to the state SAR registry and the county's board of commissioners in a written complaint with the file numbers and requested a public hearing, which is a thing anyone can do and which almost nobody does. I want to describe the 5 weeks properly because he read the paperwork is a sentence that hides an enormous amount of work. The training officer in the county to the south was a 63-year-old retired flight paramedic named Osias Wysocki, and when Kyler Haverly walked into his office in June and asked for the volunteer application, Wysocki looked at the man's DD-214 for about 90 seconds and then said, "Son, what are you actually here for?" Kyler told him the truth, all of it. It took 9 minutes. Osias Wysocki listened, and then he did not say anything encouraging, and he did not say anything sympathetic. What he said was, "If you do this angry, you'll go for the man and you'll miss. If you do it right, you'll go for the file and the man comes with it. Which are we doing?" They did the file. 5 weeks, 4 evenings a week, at a folding table in the back of an equipment bay that smelled like rope and neoprene. Regional training records, which are held by 6 different entities. Recert dates, course rosters from 3 states. Attendance sheets from a Swiftwater course in Salida in 2013 that had to be requested twice. The state registry export, which arrives as a spreadsheet with 11,000 rows and no documentation. Kyler Haverly, who had a 19-year habit of building a picture from fragments, built it. And Osias Wysocki, who knew what every field in every one of those documents actually meant, told him which fragments were nothing and which were everything. The thing that finally broke it open was not a certificate, it was an attendance sheet. Salida, April 2013, Swiftwater technician, 5 days. Bass Pallister's name is on the sign-in for day 1 and day 2, and it is not on days 3, 4, or 5, and days 3, 4, and 5 are the water days. He had taken the classroom and gone home, and 9 years later, on the 4th of April 2019, standing on a bank above a snow bridge with a 58-year-old man in the water below it, he had made the specific error that days 3, 4, and 5 exist to prevent. Osias Wysocki looked at that attendance sheet for a long time. Then he said, "Okay, now we're not doing this for your boy." The hearing was on a Tuesday in September, in a room that seats 60, in the county administration building in the town of Threadgold, and about 140 people came. Bas Pallister was there. He was there because he had to be, and because he still believed, genuinely, right up to about the 11-minute mark, that he could carry a room. That was the only skill he had ever really had, and it had never once failed him. Kyler Haverly sat in the third row and did not speak for the first hour. He had asked the board, in writing, to invite 2 people. The first was the training officer from the county to the south. The second was Marco Ostberg's daughter, who was 31 and lived in Denver, and who had not, until the letter arrived, ever been given any reason to think her father's death was anything other than terrain. When Kyler finally spoke, he spoke for 11 minutes. 3 men in that room told the reporter afterward that his voice never changed once. He did not mention his son. Not once. Not one word. That was deliberate, and it was the most disciplined thing he did in the entire 2 years, because his lawyer had told him that a single sentence about the criminal case in that room would poison it. He talked about paperwork. He read the roster. He read the registry. He put both up on the projector side by side. 5 disciplines. And he did what he had done for 19 years in briefings, which is state a fact and then stop talking so that the fact can sit there. And then he played 11 minutes of archived radio from the 4th of April 2019. You could hear the water on it. I have listened to a transcript of what happened in that room afterward, and it is not dramatic in the way people expect. Nobody shouted. There was, according to 2 accounts, a very long stretch of quiet, and then a county commissioner named Fintan Pallister, Bass's own cousin, which tells you how small that valley is, asked to be recused, and left the room, and did not look at him. Bas Pallister was removed from the roster that evening by a vote of 5-0. And the wall came down, in the most literal sense available, over the following 11 days. The newspaper ran the registry story. The family in Texas asked for their plaque back. The SAR liaison withdrew as a character witness, and so did both commissioners. And the widow from Kettle Road, who genuinely had had her driveway plowed for 11 winters, told a reporter the sentence that got picked up statewide, which was, "He was very good to me. I don't know what to do with that." Nobody had to prove Bas Pallister was a monster. They only had to prove he was a liar about the one thing his whole standing rested on, and once that was true, every character witness in the county became a person who did not want to be quoted. The trial was in February. It lasted 6 days. Zosha Brennick did not make it about the wall. She made it about the calendar. She put the 2 lists on a board and walked a jury through 23 dates, and the defense's coincidence argument, which had been strong in June, was in February being made by a lawyer whose client had just been publicly established to have signed 9 years of patient care reports on an expired certificate. The moment the trial turned came on the 4th day, and it was not from a document. Octavian Sedlak, who is a genuinely excellent lawyer, had spent 2 days establishing that Kyler Haverly was a man with a background in target analysis who had constructed a theory and then gone looking for facts to support it, and he was doing well with it, and on the 4th day he put that to him directly on cross. He said, "You built these 2 lists yourself, didn't you, Mr. Haverly?" Kyler said yes. He said, "You decided in advance what they were going to show." And Kyler Haverly said, "No, I expected them to show nothing." Sedlak, who had a follow-up ready for a denial, asked the question you are not supposed to ask, which is, why? Because. And Kyler Haverly said, and the court reporter's transcript has it, and Zosha Brennick read it aloud in her close, "Because for 2 years I thought my son didn't want to talk to me. I built that list to find out whether the 7 months were my fault. That's what I was looking for. The rest of it was in the way." The room did not do anything dramatic, but 2 jurors were crying, and the defense's entire architecture, the guilty absent father constructing a theory, stopped being available in that sentence, because the man in the box had just testified that he built the evidence hoping it would convict him. Sedlak did not ask another question about the lists. The jury was out for 4 hours and 11 minutes. Bassett Pallister is serving 24 years. He'll be 62. And now the last part, and it is the part I have thought about every day for 3 weeks, and it is the reason I wanted to tell this one. Because there is one more thing that happened, and it happened between the hearing in September and the trial in February, and if I had read it in a novel, I would have thrown the novel across the room. On the 2nd of November, at 4:40 in the afternoon, a call came into the county that a snowmobile had gone through ice on the lower Threadgold drainage, one rider, in the water, and that the reporting party was a man on the far bank who had seen it happen. Kyler Haverly was, by then, 4 months into his second career. He had put in for a compassionate reassignment and been given it, and he was living in a rented place in Threadgold 40 minutes from his son, and he was on the roster of the county to the south, which shares a mutual aid agreement. He was 11 minutes closer than anybody else. The rider in the water was Bass Pallister. He had been out alone, on a machine he could not afford to insure anymore, on ice that no certified swiftwater technician would have gone near, in a month when that drainage does not freeze properly. And I do not know. Nobody knows, and I want to be honest about that, whether he was working or whether he was doing something else. Kyler Haverly got there at 4:51. There is a recording. There is always a recording. That is the whole theme of this story. The county records its radio traffic, and there is a body-worn camera on the second responder, who arrived at 4:58, and there is 7 minutes of a man in a dry suit on a rope, on ice, working. He got him out at 4:59. Hypothermic, in and out, aspirated water, cardiac irritability, the specific set of things that kill people 20 minutes after you pull them out, not while they're in. Kyler Haverly ran that resuscitation on the bank for 31 minutes and in the helicopter for another 20, and Bass Pallister's heart stopped twice, and he brought it back twice, and the man who broke his son's skull was breathing when they landed in Grand Junction. On the recording, at some point in the middle of it, you can hear Bass Pallister say his name, just the surname, and then, twice, please. And you can hear Kyler Haverly answer him, once. And what he says is not a speech. It is 4 words that a paramedic says to a patient 1,000 times in a career, in the flattest, most professional voice in the world. I've got you. Breathe. That recording was played in that valley for a year. It was played at a state SAR conference. It was played eventually at a sentencing hearing by the prosecution over a defense objection because Zosia Brennick argued, and the judge agreed, that it went to the question of what the defendant knew about the man he had spent 2 years teaching a child to forget. Bass Pallister sat in a courtroom and listened to the voice of the man he had tried to erase, keeping him alive. He did not go to prison because Kyler Haverly beat him. He went to prison because a nurse wrote down a sentence, because a mother did arithmetic she did not want to do, because a boy wrote 41 messages he never sent, and because a man on an aircraft over the Atlantic decided that the correct target was not a person but a belief, is what I'm saying. And he spent his first year inside knowing, and everyone he had ever charmed knowing, that on the 2nd of November, he had been 31 minutes of somebody else's work away from being dead, and that the somebody was Kyler Haverly, who did not pause. Lowen Haverly is 19 now. He still has the maps. There are more of them. He did a season on a trail crew and he is studying hydrology, which is exactly what you would expect from a kid who could look at contour lines at 11 and tell you where the water goes. He speaks to his mother every day. They did 2 years of therapy together and it was, by both their accounts, brutal. And it worked. He was asked once, by a school newspaper, what the worst part had been. Everybody expected him to say the barn. He said the 7 months. He said the worst part was the 7 months when he'd worked out the rule and was following it perfectly and nothing bad was happening, because that was the stretch where he'd decided the way to be safe was to stop reaching for his father, and it had worked, and he had been proud of himself for figuring it out. I keep coming back to those 4 words on the patch. That others may live. No exception clause. Not that others who deserve it may live. Not that others who did not put my son on a concrete floor may live. The sentence has no room in it for the person you'd like to be an exception, and that is not a weakness in the sentence. That is the entire load-bearing structure of it. Because here's what I think actually happened on that ice on the 2nd of November, and it isn't about mercy. And I don't think Kyler Haverly forgave anybody. I think a man who has spent 19 years being one specific thing got handed the one situation in his life where he could have stopped being it and found out that he couldn't. Not wouldn't, couldn't. It wasn't a choice he made on the bank. The choice had been made 1,000 cold nights earlier, in every drill and every call, and every one of the 11 times he had put his hands into somebody's throat to make an airway. And that turned out to be the thing that finished Bass Pallister, in a way that a beating never could have. Because a beating would have made them equivalent, two men who hurt people. Instead, the whole valley got to watch, in 7 minutes of body cam and 51 minutes of resuscitation, precisely what the difference between those two men actually was, measured out in something no jury has to be persuaded of. There's a practical thing here too, and I'd feel bad not saying it. If there is a child in your life who keeps getting hurt, and every single incident has a completely reasonable explanation, and they usually will, do not spend your time arguing about any one of them. You will lose. Every individual incident in this story was defensible. Get a piece of paper and write the dates down, just the dates. Then write down what else was happening in those weeks. Birthdays, visits, calls, contact with somebody outside the house, a trip, a new friend. Injuries lie one at a time, and tell the truth in a row. And if you're the one on the other end of a phone that a kid keeps trying to reach, if you're deployed, if you're working nights, if you're the parent who isn't there, save everything. The messages, the timestamps, the boring log nobody would ever want to read. Not because you'll need it. Because the one time somebody does, it will be the only thing in the world that is not somebody's word against somebody else's. 41 unsent drafts on a school tablet convicted a man that 140 character witnesses could not save. Take care of your people and keep the receipts. I'll see you in the next one.